Opportunity to just give a couple of reminders. CLE credit, back of the room. Please remember to bring back your badges when you return tomorrow. We will have, again, light breakfast at 8 a.m. and we will start up on time at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. And now I'm honored to introduce to you our keynote speaker and final speaker of the day, former Governor of Hawaii, Linda Lingle. Linda was the 6th Governor of Hawaii from 2002 until 2010 and was the first female governor of the state. In the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, she was a leader in ensuring state and local government cooperation in the fight against terror. During the 2004 Republican National Convention in New York City, Governor Lingle served as chairwoman of the convention. She has also served as a senior advisor to Governor Bruce Rauner and chief operating officer for the state of Illinois. Please welcome the Honorable Linda Lingle.
Thank you very much. Aloha. To those of you who have been sitting since 9 o'clock this morning, I very much appreciate you hanging in for these last few moments. I want to begin by thanking Nitsana and Shurat HaDin for this conference. It has given me new information, it's taught me a lot, and I think most importantly, and I think you probably agree, it's forced me to ponder things more deeply than I would have before I came here, particularly because you have speakers who have such obviously different points of view on almost everything. And I think that's very helpful. You might be wondering, Hawaii? Wait, I went my honeymoon to Hawaii. What are they talking about terrorism? And maybe we went for our anniversary. Anybody here been to Hawaii before, right? Do you think about terrorism when you're in Hawaii? No, no one thinks about terrorism unless you're the governor of a state located 2,500 miles from anywhere, a place where Pacific Command is located. That means the head of every branch of the American military for the entire Asia-Pacific region is located in Honolulu. You don't see that when you're there as a visitor, but it is a key important part of our nation and the world's security, as well as the state of Hawaii. My term as governor began between the occurrence of 9/11 and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security for our country. Now again, you might not think of Hawaii as a place where you even think about terrorism, but of course it was the place and it was the scene of the second most deadly attack on American soil, and that was at Pearl Harbor 75 years ago. When I think of 9/11 here in New York City, I remember what people told me about it who were living here, that it was a beautiful day. It was a sunny day. It was blue sky. The same thing was true in Pearl Harbor. It was a Sunday morning. It was just before 8 o'clock in the morning when the Japanese planes flew over then the territory of Hawaii and started to drop bombs indiscriminately because there were many civilians involved as well as military members. I mentioned the climate and the scenery of the day, both here and in Hawaii in particular, because when the subject is lone wolf terrorism, they want it to be in places that you would never expect it. Places that are supposed to be removed from that kind of activity. So not only do we have PACOM in Hawaii, Pacific Command, but we also have cruise ships from all over the world. People on a cruise ship are carefree. They're just coming to cruise around the world, between the islands. And for me as the governor, that was always the softest of soft targets. There's almost no security in the ports, and yet you have thousands of people on the ship, often from many, many different parts of the world. And again, not expecting it. And of course, Hawaii also was where President Obama was born, he spent at least 2 weeks a year every year in the state of Hawaii, as well as other celebrities. And to me, that made Hawaii the perfect soft target. In addition, and this is true for Europe and for New York, but especially true in Hawaii, one of the goals of this kind of terrorism is to impact tourism. Tourism is 10% of the European economy today. It's over 30% of the Hawaii economy. If people can be scared to come to your location, your economy can be devastated. And what we experienced after 9/11, just imagine, who wants to get into a locked airplane and fly for 5 hours from anywhere to get to the state of Hawaii? It is devastating when it occurs. When the Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003, it began as a very inward-looking agency. All of us can remember the color coding and the discussions around the color coding. But at that time, I think maybe unbeknownst to the Department of Homeland Security, because we were looking at the mainland United States, that's where the emphasis was, our allies in the Asia-Pacific region could not understand what was happening. They couldn't get to the Department of Homeland Security, which now encompassed immigration, customs service. These were agencies that they were used to dealing with, but now they're part of this new Department of Homeland Security. Those of us in Hawaii were used to speaking to our allies in Japan and in Korea and in the Philippines, and now they felt locked out. So Hawaii became a focal point, and in that same year that the Department of Homeland Security began, we sponsored the Asia-Pacific Homeland Security Summit. Mr. Woolsey was a speaker at that inaugural summit. Hawaii's isolation forces us to partner with law enforcement, military, first responders at all levels. And that's what I want to focus my attention on today. The key to minimizing this kind of attack, and I learned today maybe lone wolf isn't a perfect description. Maybe individual jihadi is a description. Maybe there are other descriptions. We've heard them all today. But I don't really care what you call them. Others care what you call them. I don't. It's the type of attack, which means it can happen anywhere, at any time, involves small numbers of people that perhaps could have been detected, but were not detected. And I'm going to talk with some specific recommendations about how we might be able to minimize. I don't think we can ever eliminate, but we can minimize these kinds of attacks. I want to touch first, though, on one other aspect of what was discussed today. I'm a journalist by background before I was a politician. And so the discussion of First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of association are all very important concepts to me, and I know to all Americans. And whether the actions we're talking about taking, the recommendations you heard today, some of the recommendations that I might make, whether they're local actions or federal actions, they are going to involve finding a balance between security and safety for the people in our respective countries and liberty and freedom and privacy. This balancing act is not new to America. It was true, this need for balance. It was an issue at the founding of our country in the 18th century. It was an issue during the Civil War when our country could have split apart into two nations, when President Lincoln, who we revere in America, once went along with suspending habeas corpus. People could be picked up without being charged and could be held without being charged. It was a big discussion at the time. So it was the founding of the country, the Civil War. It was an issue during the Cold War, the Communist Scare, and the McCarthy trials in the 20th century. And it's an issue now in the 21st century in this war on terrorism. One of the challenges is that war is not something that the local communities are really involved with, except that soldiers might come from local communities. They have never been seen as a part of fighting a war. Maybe during the Second World War they collected aluminum or they planted a victory garden, but that really was the extent of it. This war is different from my perspective. I want to read you what the Heritage Foundation says about the local federal aspect of this kind of war. They said federal law enforcement is not designed to fight against this kind of threat. It went on to say counter-terrorism conversation should focus on how to take advantage of the decentralized and community-focused and well-positioned nature of state and local law enforcement. By the way, before I was the governor of Hawaii, I was the mayor of Maui. So I'm thinking of this as both a local, really local level as well as a state level. The Terrorism Research Initiative describes lone wolves as the most puzzling and unpredictable form of terrorism. I think it can be not just the most unpredictable and puzzling, but the most terrifying form of terrorism, because the attacks are so incongruous to the surroundings. They don't belong there. The street in Chelsea is not a place for war. A run in the Jersey Shore for charity is not a place for war. So it's incongruous, and that makes it terrifying to those of us who are average citizens trying to live our lives. We expect it on the battlefield. We don't expect it on the baseball field. Lone wolf attacks may result in a small number of casualties, relatively speaking, but the psychological impact is huge. I want to talk for a moment about the Boston Marathon bombing as it relates to my recommendations, because we've heard about it today. And here are a couple of facts as it relates to that bombing. It occurred more than a decade after 9/11. And you heard today about information sharing. More than a decade after 9/11, the lack of information sharing, the Boston Marathon bombing, was a significant issue. That bombing occurred on April 15th of 2013, less than 1 month later, while testifying before the House Committee on Homeland Security. The Massachusetts Undersecretary for Homeland Security, Kurt Schwartz, testified this. He said that although the state police had 7 troopers who were assigned full-time to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, not one member of the state police force or the Fusion Center, which was funded by the Federal Department of Homeland Security, not one of them had any information or knowledge that the FBI had interviewed the Sanaya brothers. Not one bit of information, and 7 full-time people were a part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So how could it happen, more than a decade after 9/11, that the federal government was still not communicating the way I believe they will have to fight this? How could it happen? Here are my ideas, my recommendations, and sometimes I think simple solutions are best. I know it's a complex world, I know these are complex issues, but sometimes I think we overcomplicate things, and maybe just keep it simple. Number one, the federal government has to affirmatively ask local law enforcement and local communities for their help. And they have to do it publicly. And they have to do it often, and they have to do it sincerely. Say, we need your help. We can't do this by ourselves. And the numbers explain why this is critical to the success of us fighting this kind of war. Here are the numbers. There are only 14,000 FBI agents in the United States. There are 34,000 NYPD officers in the city of New York. There are 800,000 local and state law enforcement officers across the country. But there are others besides law enforcement who will have to be asked for their help as well. People's neighbors will have to be asked for their help. Store clerks, landlords, motel managers, teachers. It was mentioned that the UK has passed a law requiring teachers to report. I want to suggest a variation for us in America, that we're not going to require people to report, because I think that might tip that balance I was talking about earlier for us. But a way to involve the American population in this war is, first of all, to call it a war, to make it clear to everyone that it's a war, and that we are all involved in this war. Americans often talk about that it's too bad young people don't serve in the military anymore, or don't do national service as they do in Israel or as we used to do. This is a way, it's an important way to let everyone know they have a role to play. I respect the UK's approach, and I'm just pray that that works for them. They've been very successful, but I think here, just doing the kind of outreach I'm describing would be very important. Number two, I think we need to increase the cyber capabilities at the local and state level. While they are building up some capabilities, and the larger cities have tremendous capabilities, most cities and states, I think, lack the kind of analytics that Ambassador Woolsey was talking about, or anything even approaching that. So I think that would be also important. And finally, this federal information sharing. We can't just talk about it, we have to do it. It's been talked about a long time. Everybody will say, oh yeah, we really share now, but they really don't share the way we need to in order to win this war. I talked earlier about that balance between security and freedom, and fear is something will cause us, I think, to tip the balance. The local and state leaders, I feel, must push back on this idea that the federal government has become a first responder. This started in our country after Hurricane Katrina. Now, those of you who have been involved in local or state government, this is how it's supposed to work. If there's a natural disaster, the mayor does their very best to deal with it. If they can't handle it, it gets beyond their resources, then you call upon the governor, and the state brings its resources to bear. And if that is still not enough, then you call on the federal government to step in and help. Katrina turned that upside down. The federal government became a first responder in natural disasters, and the reason that will never work, and the reason that will never work in this war on terror, is because they don't know the local communities, they don't have situational awareness in the local communities, they're seen as outsiders, they don't have the trust of the local people on the ground. So whether it's a natural disaster or it's a war on terror, the local communities will have to be involved if we're to be successful. After Katrina, there was even a move to federalize the National Guard in the 50 states. That means the president would step in, and the governors are very protective of this because we are the commanders-in-chief of our National Guard in each of the 50 states. But after Katrina, they said, no, we're going to have to step in, we're going to take over the National Guard in the 50 states. And in a bipartisan, unanimous show of opposition, the governors pushed back on the president. It was President Bush at the time, and pushed back on that, and they dropped that because the governors knew that would never work. And our war on terror in this country will never work until the local communities are involved. So the governors pushed back and they stopped it, and I think we need to stand up and say as local communities, involve us. We can be a part of the solution, but it can't just be rhetoric. It has to be in fact. The federal government, the sooner they recognize this, I think the more successful we're going to be in fighting the war on terror. Thank you again for showing me the respect of staying around. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Governor. That wraps up our day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And again, we'll start up right on time at 9 a.m. Thank you.